College of Social Work at the University of Houston. Today, I'm very excited to welcome you to our 5th annual Social Justice Solutions event and the first in our 3-part series, Eyes on Abolition, in which we'll be exploring abolition as a critical framework for change, beginning today with Dr. Ruth Wilson Gilmore. Today's event will feature a talk from Dr. Gilmore, a moderated discussion with one of our GCSW alumni, Niolis Palomo, followed by questions from our community that were pre-solicited through our social media channels, as well as questions that you submit live this afternoon through the chat functions, which we'll be monitoring. A quick note about captions. Although we weren't able to arrange for live captioning, after the event is over, captions will be available in the recorded version of today's event, which will be available on our YouTube channel. And these captions can be accessed in multiple languages. But before we begin, I'd like to take a minute to tell you about the origins of this event and what it means to us at the Graduate College of Social Work. At the Graduate College of Social Work, our mission is to prepare our students to do the work necessary to achieve social, racial, economic, and political justice for all. I tell every one of our students that when they graduate, I expect them to not only be advocates for change, but to be activists and leaders to bring about the changes necessary in our society to achieve justice. And this event began because of one of our students who took on this responsibility. Shortly after my first year as dean in the summer of 2016, one of our students, Miranda Harris, came to me because she was concerned about what was becoming an epidemic of police violence in the Black community. And she wanted to know what we as a college could do to address this. This was just shortly after the murders of Alton Sterling and Philando Castile, both at the hands of the police. And we knew we needed to do something to educate our students, not just about the issue, but to equip them with skills to identify solutions. So our first event was held in fall 2016, and it focused on what we can do as a community to address police violence in the Black community. But we realized that these conversations couldn't stop after just one event. So we've continued to engage in these conversations. Over the years, we've hosted Angela Davis, DeRay McKesson, Patrice Cullors, and many others who've spoken to our students and our community about not just the harms of police violence, but also the greater harm that racism causes in our society. But now here we are, 5 years after our first event, and the problem of police violence in the Black community has only become worse. Just since the fall of 2016, when this event began, we've witnessed the murders of Keith Lamont Scott, Terrence Crutcher, Stephon Clark, Jordan Edwards, Botham Jean, Willie McCoy, Elijah McClain, Tatiana Jefferson, Breonna Taylor, Sean Reed, Tony McDade, George Floyd, Rayshard Brooks, and many others, each at the hands of law enforcement. This continued assault on Black lives has led to many conversations about what needs to happen to bring about change and whether change is even possible. Can a system of policing that was formed with a racist intent ever truly become a system that values Black lives? This summer, we've seen an increase in calls to defund the police, to abolish prisons, all as a means of achieving racial justice. Prior to the tragedies we witnessed this summer, abolition was a subject many of us knew little about, but it is now a subject that is very much part of our public discourse. And while we've seen this issue divide many in our country, we've also seen this issue divide the social work community in ways that few others have, which is why we're engaging in this conversation, to listen, to learn, and to educate ourselves on how we can be a part of the solution. So I thank you for joining us today and encourage you to submit your questions and your comments via the chat. And now I'd like to introduce our speaker, Dr. Ruth Wilson Gilmore. Ruth Wilson Gilmore is Professor of Earth and Environmental Sciences and Director of the Center for Place, Culture, and Politics at the City University of New York Graduate Center. Co-founder of many grassroots organizations, including the California Prison Moratorium Project, Critical Resistance, and the Central California Environmental Justice Network, Dr. Gilmore is author of the prize-winning book, Golden Gulag, Prisons, Surplus, Crisis, and Opposition in Globalizing California. Her recent publications include Beyond Grattan in the text Policing the Planet, Abolition Geography and the Problem of Innocence in the book Futures of Black Radicalism, a foreword to Bobby M. Wilson's Birmingham classic, America's Johannesburg, and a foreword to the collection of essays Cedric J. Robinson on racial capitalism, Black internationalism, and cultures of resistance. Her forthcoming projects include Change Everything, Racial Capitalism and the Case for Abolition, and Stuart Hall, Selected Writings on Race and Difference, co-edited with Paul Gilroy. In April 2019, novelist Rachel Kuchner profiled Gilmore in the New York Times Magazine. Honors include the American Studies Association Angela Y. Davis Award for Public Scholarship in 2012, the Association of American Geographers Harold Rose Award for Anti-Racist Research and Practice in 2014, the SUNY Purchase College Eugene B. Grant Distinguished Scholar Prize for Social and Environmental Justice, the American Studies Association Richard A. Yarborough Mentorship Award, and the Association of American Geographers Lifetime Achievement Award in 2020. Please welcome Dr. Ruth Gilmore.
Thank you very much, Dean Detlef. Thank you very much to the entire team that has so wonderfully made it possible for me to participate in this important conversation this evening. I'm delighted to be here and I look forward to our conversation. I have said many times over the years that where life is precious, life is precious. And that seems to be so poignant today in all aspects of life throughout the United States and beyond. The pandemic, of course, has intensified how we think about life and how often and with what terror and concern many kinds of people who might not have imagined that they might experience premature death themselves have come to be conscious of it. It's also true that over the last 30 years, so long, far before this pandemic was even an idea in our consciousness, the United States had already embarked on a phenomenal prison expansion program throughout the states at different rates, in different intensities, in different places, but that summed up by the end of the 1990s, the biggest prison expansion project in the history of the world. The US then and now imprisons the greatest number of people on the planet in absolute numbers, and also the highest rate as a rate of the population. What also has happened over these last 30 years, or 40 years, or really 50, is that things that should be easy have become more and more difficult to do, while things that should be difficult, like locking people up or letting people get sick and die because of a pandemic, seem to have become easy, which is to say, there isn't a lot of organized effort to keep those things from happening. The economic upheavals of the last 45 years shape a lot of the underlying forces that have led to a reconfiguration throughout the United States of people, places, and things. And those of you who study geography know that the fundamental relations that geographers study is the relationship between and among people, places, and things. So that it extends from anywhere like Houston and Houston's constant volatile relationship with the oil and gas business, throughout the Gulf, up through the center of the United States, out to the extreme coasts on the west and the east, to Alaska, to Hawaii, and again, throughout the world. The reconfiguration of people, places, and things pushed all kinds of households, communities, economies, and industries into motion. And that motion set loose, as it were, unmoored. Some might say liberated, others might say pushed off the cliff, labor and land and money and the state's capacity to organize these things. One of the things that many states, the state of Texas, the state of California, the US federal government, and many other states have organized has been expanded prisons and detention centers and other means by which people are held in place against their will for part or all of their lives. The general forces that I use, the general terms that I use to describe these forces are the terms organized abandonment and organized violence. Let me talk about them for a few minutes. Organized abandonment is a concept that lets us think seriously about how it happens that an economy, a way of life, jobs, schools, all of the things that make it possible for people to live in a relatively stable and secure way, disappear. We know, because we study the Rust Belt, that many of the manufacturing centers of the United States have left big cities and small throughout the US, particularly the Rust Belt, since the mid-1970s. We know that throughout South Texas today, there's a huge upheaval going on in which a lot of investment has come in to bring gas up out of the ground. And at the same time, because of the economic downturn produced by the pandemic and related crises, that investment might or might not be drying up. We know that in California, a state that has had as one of its major metropolitan areas, one of the great manufacturing centers of the United States, Los Angeles, has experienced a huge shift in the kinds of things that people make in Los Angeles. So where in the mid to the late latter part of the 20th century, people were making high-wage goods in steel and automobile and aerospace, what people make now are high value added, low wage goods in areas such as apparel. So Los Angeles is still a manufacturing center, but what it manufactures has changed. The wages have changed, and therefore the vulnerability of people to such crises as the COVID pandemic or wildfires or huge changes in the cost of real estate or rental or food or healthcare has made people extremely vulnerable. As I said, the state, which is to say various governments, joining the two major political parties in most cases, not dividing them as much as one might think, the state has arranged or reconfigured people and money and land into, among other things, prison after prison after prison. The organized abandonment that has thrown people into free fall, into vulnerable situations, into uncertainty, has been in many places shaped by a growth and consolidation of the forces of organized violence. And those include, but are not limited to, police forces. Indeed, it's my view that it's possible for the US to have become the lead prisoner on the planet because police forces and the forces of organized violence have been authorized to kill people rather than the other way around. Many people think, it's because they can lock us up that they can kill us. I think it's the other way around. And just to remind those who are listening, who might be skeptical of what I've been saying, I should like to point out that in the United States, there is a police killing on the average 3 times a day. Now, that's much lower than in Brazil, where it happens 9 times a day, and yet higher by orders of magnitude than in many, many, many other countries, including countries to which the United States is fond of comparing itself. The organization of people and money and land and the state's capacity to put these things together gives us, if we think as abolitionists, some insights into what possibilities actually might be right in front of us if we put ourselves together in an organized way to change things. Abolitionists, starting out in the late 1990s, reached out to every kind of community, every kind of organized person, unions, community organizations, faith organizations, people who are part of the system that produces health and well-being for ordinary people. We reached out to government policymakers, to disgruntled small business owners, all kinds of people throughout the United States, to see what it is they could see in what they already did that could change in such a way that it would support the preciousness of life if they had the resources to do that. If they had the resources to do that. And what we've learned over and over and over again is that ordinary people under extraordinary circumstances tend, in our experience, to choose the preciousness of life, whether it's children in rural California whose families work in the agriculture industry, in fields and in packing houses, who, as vulnerable kids, see that what makes their lives feel not precious has everything to do with how vulnerable they feel to police, pesticides, and prisons. Or in many, many, many stretches of the rural United States, people who have no access to health institutions, to rural hospitals, and the other kinds of social goods that had once proliferated throughout the country to help people of whatever income and whatever line of work to protect their health and give them protections from calamity as well as opportunities for advancement, to be healthier, to be educated, that those people as well tell us over and over again that if they had the resources, the phrase that people use all the time is, in an ideal world, they would have community colleges instead of prisons. They would have parks and schools and other socially enlivening institutions instead of prisons. I have talked in recent years to people who, like social workers, are involved in trying as professionals and as committed members of their communities to make life's preciousness realized. I've talked to social workers, for example, in Southern Connecticut, where I discovered, as I think I'm going to discover again tonight, the social workers had no trouble understanding the things that I was talking about because of the kind of complex system analysis every social worker brings to the job. I spent some time a few weeks ago talking with the California Nurses Association and the National Nurses Organizing Committee, where 1,000 shop stewards and members of the union from all over California and all over the country came together to talk about how abolition shapes or should shape the kinds of demands and the kinds of purposes that enliven a union like the nurses' union. Indeed, 20 years ago, when we were organizing in Central California, trying to stop the state of California from building a $250 million prison instead of putting money into schools and hospitals and community well-being, the nurses were among the organized workers who were the quickest to say they understood what we were talking about. I've mentioned farm workers, people working in immigrant rights, students everywhere, environmental justice people. In fact, in the greater Houston area, looking east from Houston, across the Gulf, past Galveston, and then down toward New Orleans, we find that people who wrote away to Lois Ahrens in Western Massachusetts to get copies of her fantastic documentary comics called The Real Cost of Prison were also people who live in that vast region called Cancer Alley, and also people who are experiencing in their households and communities very high rates of imprisonment. So we see health, the real cost of prison, and high rates of imprisonment. About half of the US labor force today has some kind of disqualifying arrest or conviction record, whether or not they've ever been locked up, that keeps them from being eligible, at least on the books, to do the kinds of jobs that modestly educated people in the prime of life do in the United States: making, moving, growing, and caring for things and other people. We see that that fact has had a downward pressure on wages. We see that people who work in healthcare are not only made vulnerable to COVID and other kinds of illnesses because of inadequate working conditions and protective equipment, but also their households and communities are vulnerable because many people who work in healthcare, especially in in-home social services, are not eligible for unemployment and other kinds of wage protection and support at a time when unemployment is running in the tens of millions throughout the country. So I look forward to our discussion as we move forward in our conversation. I do want to show one slide. I wonder if my host could put the slide up. This is a slide that we can return to in the conversation. It's a slide that shows how many people are locked up in the United States. And what is interesting about this slide, of course, as you can see, is that the biggest chunk is green. That's people in state prison. The next biggest chunk is orange. Those are people in jail who are mostly being held pending trial or pending adjudication of their case. And over on the right, if you look at the right, yes, it is your right. If you look at the column that's purple at the top and then green and then gray, we see people who are held in a variety of other situations, including immigrant detention. We add all of this together. These are the people who are being held at sites, mostly buildings, against their will. There are also millions of people who are restricted from moving around, who are detained at home with ankle monitors and otherwise restricted from moving through the community. So throughout the United States, the extent of prison has been so particularly apparent because of COVID, because prisons and jails are petri dishes for the proliferation of this particular virus. And while many, many jurisdictions talked about ensuring that everyone who could be released would be released in order to reduce the density within prisons, the fact is the releases have been quite low. And later, not now, but later, we can look at a slide and do a little comparison. But at this point, what I'd like us to do is open up the conversation and think very hard about the fact that for abolition, we have learned through all of the people we've talked to, all of the movements and organizations and various kinds of jurisdictions that we've worked through, that to achieve the reality of life being precious, we only have to change one thing. We have to change everything. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Gilmore. Now we're going to transition to the Q&A portion of our event, moderated by GCSW alumna Niolis Palomo. Niolis Palomo Garcia currently serves as the Texas Campaign and Partnership Strategist with the Immigrant Legal Resource Center. Niolis is a political refugee from Cuba who has been fortunate to call Houston her second home. Niolis' passion for advancing immigrant rights, commitment to reforming the criminal legal system, and experience in community organizing, policy, and advocacy has allowed her to effectively advocate for comprehensive local policy solutions that address the overcriminalization and incarceration of communities of color. Prior to joining the ILRC, Niolis worked at the ACLU of Texas as an engagement manager, where she worked collaboratively and strategically with 5 unique coalitions, 2 of which covered immigrants' rights and criminal justice issues. Niolis has a bachelor's degree in social work from the University of Houston downtown and her master's degree in social work from the University of Houston's Graduate College of Social Work. In 2018, while a student at the GCSW, Niolis initiated and co-led a conversation on race and privilege with distinguished activists Angela Davis and Jane Elliott, drawing an audience of more than 5,000 community members. And today, Niolis joins us as our moderator for our continued discussion with Dr. Gilmore. Niolis, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dean, and thank you so much, Dr. Gilmore. It is an absolute honor to be with you this afternoon and just go over some questions that we've been wanting to really delve into. I can say that as an organizer, your work and your research has influenced me so much as an organizer and social worker as well. So it is a privilege to be with you this afternoon. So let's go ahead and get started with our first question. One of the things that you are known for is saying where life is precious, which I think is the essence of abolitionist. This quote that you often say ties into the social work code of ethics, which says social workers respect the inherent dignity and worth of the person. But for many in our community, abolition is a new idea. And we really want to dive right into the heart of what has proven to be an incredibly divisive idea, not only in our country, but for us in the social work community. So defunding the police. Let's start with a 2-part question. First, can you explain how defunding the police is linked to abolition? And secondly, what context can you provide for social workers that sheds a light on the link between abolition and social justice?
Great questions. All right, defunding the police. One of the points I made in my opening remarks that I hope will help people think calmly about defunding the police, and I realize it's quite a challenging concept, is to understand that the shape of public life, when it comes to the kinds of things we have for public well-being, has changed significantly over the past decades. And we have upon us a situation where schools are very hard-pressed to provide to all children who go to school to learn adequate teachers, materials, everything. The buildings are not good in many places. It's all very hard. Defunding the police, many people think of as a mass unemployment program. Not in my view. Defunding the police demands that we stop and think, what is it that we need in our community to make our communities flourish, to make our communities better rather than think about what to do when things get bad. It's a different attitude toward life. I, for one, am not the least bit interested in saving money. So defund the police to the extent that some people say, oh, we can reduce the budget. Nah, the budget should be bigger. You remember they printed trillions of dollars in Washington in March, I think it was, and April, more. They can do more of that. And I can defend that as an economist if anybody needs that to be defended. As I've said to many prison guards I've talked to over the years, I don't mind how much money you make. I'm perfectly happy for you getting your salary. What I'm not happy about and what is not conducive to enhancing the well-being of individuals and communities is having more and more people watching people lives wither in cages, or having more and more people whose job it is to be in uniform in a school or on a street when other kinds of relationships could in advance solve the problems everybody is waiting to have occur. For example, in many places now, people are trying to reduce or eliminate the presence of school resource officers who are police. As far as I'm concerned, they can keep their salaries and become reading specialists. I don't want people to be unemployed. I want us to do different things together. In schools, over the last 25 years or more, especially with the rise of so-called zero tolerance, which people can think about, the way that schools, their administrations, the way that they're designed, the way that their regulation has evolved, has been to consider children as it were, pre-criminal rather than pre-adults, right? Pre-criminal rather than pre-adults. And the great anthropologist Damien Sojourner wrote a fantastic book about this. I recommend to everybody. As I think I said, he's an anthropologist. The problem that we miss is the problem of where we begin with young people, just as we miss when we begin in the wrong place with people who are sick or suffering or elderly. And what I learned, and then I'll wrap up because I know you have other questions. What I learned is this. Many years ago, I went to talk to a group of high school students. And they were mostly brown and black students, few white students. They were the quote unquote bad kids at Berkeley High School. And all their teachers made them come and hear about prison and abolition. And their teacher, meaning well, said to them, 1 in 3 of you is going to prison. And let me tell you, none of the people in that room listened to me or anyone else, because why would you? If somebody says your life is already over, why listen? Over time, as I've worked with more and more children, including children in farm working communities and children in urban communities, white kids, brown kids, black kids, Asian American kids, Native American kids, what I learn is when we start from where life is precious, everything changes, school becomes interesting, the school resource officer is no longer what's needed for the peacefulness of learning and the excitement and rambunctiousness of learning to happen.
Exactly. Thank you, Dr. Gilmore. I know that on your keynote, you also touched a little bit about COVID and this national pandemic that we're currently under. And we know that when COVID began, we started having a lot of conversations within our community about all of the fault lines of inequity the pandemic exposed even more. One of the things that kept coming up with this idea that this moment is providing a unique opportunity to expand our moral imagination. And in fact, we have shared a quote from you to help explain and expound on that idea. And your quote says, "Abolition is about presence, not absence. It's about building life-affirming institutions." Can you talk a little bit about the thinking behind these ideas, which challenge the ways we think about change?
Sure. Another wonderful question. When I say abolition is presence, I believe some people think that what I think is it's present in my imagination. What's actually shaping my imagination is looking at what people already do. So I mentioned in my keynote that I had a wonderful experience talking with an organization of social workers who are based in and around Yale New Haven Hospital in New Haven, Connecticut. And as I mentioned, they didn't have a hard time understanding the systemic nature of the problem as I described it, because what social workers do is deal with systems. I mean, with individuals and with systems. So abolitionist presence means things like what social workers do, what drew people to become social workers was not, I don't think, to become an officer without a badge. I think people are drawn to social work because of the way that social work can help join people who are in need with the things that they need in relationships that are nurturing and through which they can flourish. What has happened to so many of us, including professors, including Dean Detleff, including me, is that we have become non-sworn officers who have more and more responsibility policing people rather than teaching, bringing people together with the kinds of resources they need, doing the work that social work needs. So abolitionist presence means look at what you do, look at what your faith community does, look at what your union does, look at what your art organization and your street organization do, and then lift up more of that. And one of the things that I've been able to do, and Angela Davis has been able to do, and Rachel Herzing and Patrice Cullors and others, have been to help people find each other and connect this work. And this is what we saw with the amazing sudden rise of abolition and its presence in the mainstream media in so many tongues, is that by moving around and seeing what people did, not telling people what to do, seeing what they do and talking, has made it possible for people to recognize each other as well as to recognize themselves as doing abolition.
Exactly. Thank you. One of the things that we often say in the social work profession is that we are here to get ourselves out of our jobs in a way, to really transition and to really tackle the root systemic issues that are happening. We really have to really tackle those systems of oppression and systemic racism in a way that will really get us out of our job. So with that being said, I wanted to ask one or two more questions. The vision statement of the Graduate College of Social Work, of which I am a proud alumni of, it says to achieve social, racial, economic, and political justice to global. We know that in order to realize this vision, we will have not only be fierce advocates, which is part of our code of ethics as social workers, but that we will have to employ every tool in our arsenal to achieve the depth and magnitude of change this vision requires. Can you talk about abolition as both a tool and a strategy to achieve sustainable change?
Yet another wonderful question. These are such good questions. Thank you for them all. Yes, as I mentioned in response to your earlier question, abolition is a vision, or maybe a better way to say it is a way of seeing. The abolition makes you ask, when you look, what are you seeing and what do you think you're seeing and what would you rather see? So seeing the problem differently from how in mainstream media or in the worst way that many of us encounter one another in the world, seeing a problem as only something that can be fixed by killing it or locking it up or making it not eligible. So when we see problems differently, then we can see how to go about solving them differently. And one of the key things that underlies abolition is what you just said about social work. And that is, abolitionists would like to stop being abolitionists, right?
Yeah.
We would really like to. So that means that the presences that we look for, so that we can bring lift them up so that other people can see themselves in the work that they already do, is we look for what people do that's sustainable. And when I say sustainable, I mean sustainable in the sense of not being winnable or at the margin a little bit better, but sustainable in the sense that the kind of life we want for ourselves and our communities can reproduce itself without fear. So let me give some examples from around the world. I talk a lot with colleagues in South Africa. In Cape Town, there's been a huge struggle in the context of pandemic, huge struggle over people's ability to live where they live. Because they live in irregular or self-built housing on land to which they might or might not have title. There are constant struggles over who gets to be where. Now, remember I said that what has happened over these last decades has been a configuration of people, places, and things. That includes where people live, whether they're living in houses they own that they can't pay the mortgage on, or houses they rent where they can't pay the rent, or a house that they built that might not be completely to code, but it is shelter and it's home. So the question is, how can what people have put together for themselves that make life's preciousness apparent be sustained? So people in Cape Town have been organizing, and just recently put out a statement, and for the first time ever used the word abolition to describe themselves in the world. Now, I haven't been there. I haven't been part of that. I don't think Angela Davis has been there. It's not like there are 3 abolitionists who roam the planet telling people what to think. That's not it. People are looking for a way to describe themselves to themselves in a way that makes hope seem like an irresistible feeling instead of something that people try to put out of their minds because things are so desperate. We also see in many communities throughout India where people have been compelled to quote unquote go home because of the pandemic, people who are long distance migrants within their own country or who had been, for example, working in the Gulf states, building all of the cities that are rising in the Gulf states, that people are trying to figure out how to make the possibilities for everyday life sustainable while they figure out what to do next. And it's not a matter of everybody, for example, finding one place that they live and that they only live and that they have to stay fixed there or glued there, but rather in developing the relationships for housing and community and schools, what we're also doing is piecing together a society again in which we're not afraid to be dependent on each other.
Mm.
Because abolition is also about radical dependency, not on some external force, on each other, on each other.
Mm-hmm. 100%. It really takes, it might sound like a cliche, but it just really takes a village to make this work happen, really. And we really need each other, and we cannot continue to work in silos, right? So it's important that as abolitionists, we continue, to work together to move forward, our vision. I have one more question, if it's okay with you. I know we have a lot of local activists that are watching our live right now. So I want to bring this conversation a little bit back to Houston as well. We have two examples of recent reform efforts here in Houston. One where the candidate for district attorney, Kim Ogg, ran on a platform of reform in the idea that social justice could not be achieved without criminal justice reform. She proposed adding 100 new prosecutors under the framework, justice delayed is justice denied. A lot of our community members understood that that reform would result in more Black and brown people in jail, while others thought it would help people sitting in jail to get out. And just last week, the mayor of Houston issued a cite and release executive order that gives officers too much discretion to arrest for citation eligible offenses. As written, the policy will disproportionately affect Black communities and people of color at alarming rates. So the question is, what advice do you have for local organizers and what they should be advocating for at the local level? How do we hold them accountable to improve these policies and use the outcomes to move us closer to abolition?
Tough questions, tough questions. Well, one of the core abolitionist principles is that we do not advocate for anything that extends the life or the scope of the prison industrial complex. So anything that makes it bigger is going against where we need to go, which is to configure people, places, and things into where life is precious, life is precious. I almost said back into, but I stopped myself because I'm not altogether sure I want to go back to anything. I want to go ahead to the world that we can make. I don't think there were these good old days. There were different days in which certain kinds of things could happen that can't happen now. Some of those relationships ought to be refreshed and renewed, and other kinds of relationships should change in order for us to become dependent on each other. We know that in the United States, on the average, throughout the criminal justice system, more than 90% of all the people who are found guilty have taken a plea. They haven't gone before a jury of their peers and so forth. We know very few people actually have a trial. Having more prosecutors only makes the system bigger. It doesn't end the problem that we began with, which is the problem that is best understood as the shift from multiple ways to think about the vulnerability and insecurity in society that could be understood as problems related to income, healthcare, jobs, housing, well-being, to a singular way of thinking social problems, which is crime is the problem and prison is the solution, or crime is the problem and punishment is the solution. And therefore, the criminal justice system has gotten to be such a big part of public life that it's not surprising that people think, oh, well, we just have to fix the big part rather than to move the big part out of the way, which is why a phrase like defund the police makes people so nervous, but why also so many people have taken it up, because they don't know how else to say, move this big thing out of the way. Get out of the way. Get out of the way. I also want to say, for example, that in Texas, so this is not just Houston, it's Texas statewide, there was a moment back in, I think, the late 1980s, when Texas was at a crossroads and could easily have reduced the number of people locked up in its prisons. But instead, political struggle that, I don't have time to go into it, turned that possibility into an expansion of the prison system. Same thing happened in California. Different kinds of people, different parties, different political kinds of political power, similar outcome. We can talk about why that similarity happened, but one thing we can say for sure is that in states like Texas and California and New York, which are big, rich states, but inequality is was deep and getting deeper and deeper and deeper, prison expansion occurred. We also know in states that have been historically deeply unequal, like Mississippi or the District of Columbia, also rising prison. And we look around the whole planet, where capitalism, saving capitalism from capitalism, has been the principal force of organized abandonment that's thrown people, places, and things into the air and into struggles to reorganize themselves. We look around the whole planet and we see everywhere, wherever inequality is the deepest, prison is the most prevalent. The United States, the United Kingdom, the Russian Federation, Brazil, South Africa. You see, there's a pattern, and the pattern isn't even only in the northern nation states or the old imperial nation states. It's global, but it's different in different places for a reason.
Yeah, exactly. I'm taking a lot of notes as you were speaking as well. I know that we have a lot of folks that are watching online that are ready to ask some questions. So we will now transition into our community Q&A, and we will start with some of the pre-submitted questions, followed by those that have submitted questions via Facebook Live. So we can go ahead and get started with some of those questions. Alrighty, so we have our first question here that I'm going to read out loud. And this question was submitted by a community member, Sakanda Joseph. And she asked, can you share more ways abolitionists can work with reformers with integrity and give an example of the concessions that had to be made, the work done in? I think
I get it. Okay. I understand the question. That's a good question. Okay. All right. So that is a great question. And let me tell you why. It's because not only is it true, as I was saying in my remarks and in the answer to one of your earlier questions, that many people who do incredibly creative, incredibly necessary work that looks like abolition to me, not all of them think they're doing abolition. They think they're just doing what they do, whether they're social workers or mutual aid organizers or what have you. In most cases, when we have been fighting in California and elsewhere for abolition, the people we've been working with have not called themselves abolitionists. They are not at all embarrassed about being reformists. And so then the question is, how can we join forces in order to realize something that we might call a non-reformist reform, i.e., a reform that will not extend the life or the scope of the prison industrial complex. And when I say prison industrial complex, let me just remind people in the audience that we mean everything. We don't just mean the buildings. We mean the uniformed personnel, the civilian personnel, the towns where prisons are, the neighborhoods where jails are, police, courts, bailiffs. We mean the investment bankers who lend money to municipalities and states to build jails and prisons and courthouses. We mean the pension funds that buy the bonds that were lent to the states so that public service employees, I am one, can have a pension someday. We mean the intellectuals, including people like me, who both come up with recommendations for policy and procedure that might lead to making the PIC bigger, or those like me who fight to make it smaller and want it to go away. The prison industrial complex is a vast thing. It's a vast thing. So within that, there are people who, for example, will advocate for particular categories of prisoners. For example, they'll advocate for youth. Great. We will advocate for youth. We've fought for years to get the state of California to shut down the California Youth Authority. That's a youth lockup. But not if those who want to shut the youth authority say the prison should be for the adults. We just say, no, we're going to work with you to shut the youth authority, but we don't want to leave anybody behind because there are all of these other people who are no longer youth whose lives are wasting away in prison as well. Then there are people who will fight for people in prisons for women. We will fight with them as long as they don't say the men should be in prison and so forth. You get my drift. So there are all these different kinds of reforms. At one point, this was really interesting. This was in the Los Angeles County fight over jail expansion. Back in the 1990s, the ACLU of Southern California filed suit in federal court on behalf of people who were held in the Los Angeles County Jail, charging that the conditions were unconstitutional, that people were getting sick, dying, you name it. And they won. And so Los Angeles County was put under a consent decree by the courts to remedy the problem. This is how Texas expanded its prisons. It was under consent decree to remedy the problem, and that's when it could have sent people home. State of lots of consent decrees. All right. So in LA County, the ACLU of Los Angeles County was charged with overseeing the realization of this remedy. And what happened was, over and over again, the county kept saying, well, we'll just build a new jail, and it'll be a better jail, and it will be a more humane jail, and it will have a better health in this and this and that. And we fought it and fought it and fought it and fought it. After a while, one of the people who had been instrumental as a lawyer, a brilliant lawyer, in getting that consent decree approved by the court, realized there was no good jail. It was never going to be thus. And that opened a door for a lot of people who are committed to reform, who are committed to making lives better for vulnerable people in jail and in communities, to see that the best thing that could happen would be for Los Angeles County not to build the new jails, to shrink down the old jails, and to put those billions of dollars into the community. And that is what, after a 15-year fight, last fall in 2019, September 2019, the Los Angeles County Board of Supervisors said, we're not going to build those jails. 15-year fight. And all that time, we were also fighting to get people out of jail, because we're not going to let people die in jail to make a moral point. Who would do that?
Mm-hmm.
Life is not precious if you do that.
Exactly. Exactly. Thank you, Dr. Gilmore. Do we have any more questions? Okay, so this question came from a student at our GCSW program, Carla Larroche, who says that she is committed to abolitionist framework as a vehicle for social good, both in terms of policing and in social work. And she has a question about how to engage with our national organization, the National Association of Social Workers, which is focused on police reform through public policy. But recently said that they are willing to talk with abolitionist social workers. So how does she get ready and prepare for that conversation that she's about to have with the National Association of Social Workers?
Rehearse. And I mean it. This is not a joke. There isn't a right answer. The only way through this is to do it. And I use the word rehearse as against recite. If there were a right answer, I could, fax you the answers and people could memorize them and just say them over and over again, and somehow magically people would change their minds. No, what the rehearsal is to figure out, to have conversations either with people who think abolition is a fool's errand, or people who agree but can't really talk about it yet. Talk it through. Ask and answer really difficult questions, as I did with those kids, farm worker kids in the South San Joaquin Valley, who really wanted me to explain to them how it could be that I wanted to abolish prisons when they knew people hurt people. And after I talked with them, not at them, with them, they sent me away. And they're the ones who on their own came up with their sense that their lives were not precious because of police prisons and pesticides, which is to say they put pesticides, what they had come to this conference to be worried about, in conversation in their own discussion with these other things they had not come to the conversation, to the conference to be worried about. And they said they saw the world differently, which is to say they could say out loud what they already experienced and then figure out a way to say it to each other and then come back and tell the adults what they thought. Right? So one of the things that I've done a lot of that your colleagues might consider doing is this. As we've gone from town to town where people are considering welcoming a new prison for the alleged jobs and benefits that would hardly ever come. What we do is we would have a kind of role play. So this is what I mean by rehearsal too. So we give everybody a little bit of a role, like a talking point, but their job was to imagine what they'd say next. So somebody would be for the prison, somebody would be the mayor, somebody would be the chronic malcontent. That's what I always play, the chronic malcontent. Somebody would be somebody who can't imagine not having a job. Somebody would be a grandma worried about her grandson moving away if they don't get these jobs, and talk it through to see what comes out the other side. And what would happen is that over and over again, in all different kinds of communities, in different parts of the United States, people found their way to a similar place, not identical, but similar. And that is that they saw that the relationship of money in the form of wages and other kinds of income benefits and land and buildings and people and the state's capacity to organize these things could be something else that wasn't hard to imagine at all once they realized the possibility was there. Then we would do design workshops where, for example, workers, either not documented to work or documented not to work, which is what people with disqualifying convictions are, would get together and say, what would we like our neighborhood to look like? And draw it out, and then talk about repurposing an already existing prison or a shuttered hospital or something else for community well-being. All of these things are possible as well. We also have talked with all kinds of people who are members of organized labor in public as well as not public employment sectors. And we found, for example, that in California, many people who are not members of the Guards Union, which is a standalone union, many people who worked for the California state prison system realized that while it is true that for a guard to be a guard, there's got to be somebody to guard, a teacher is a teacher, a social worker is a social worker, a janitor is a janitor, a locksmith is a locksmith. They could, again, think of themselves in the world in a different configuration without the prison. And so then the only question was how to drag the guards along voluntarily or not into this new world. Now, police policy is not an unimportant thing, but it is not likely, given that many, many, many communities already adopted many of the not 8 to abolition, but 8 can't wait policies, that those will solve problems. That machinery, whether it's body cams, that kind of thing, doesn't change behavior because it doesn't change the relationship of organized violence to the people who've experienced organized abandonment. That is not what happens. And you can see it in the city of Albuquerque. You can see it all over the United States.
So profound, yes, completely agree. So we have a few more questions coming up. We have a question coming from Kristen Tempora. How do you see public defenders and the individuals who work for both federal and public defender's office playing a role in the abolitionist movement?
Public defenders are amazing, totally amazing. And they are unsung heroes of a system that, as I said earlier this afternoon, is one that has become so routinized, which is to say, in a way, so industrialized, that people are criminalized the way a car is made on an assembly line. That it's just, there's a regular number of steps, and at the end, it comes off the line with a whole lot of, as it were, mechanical inputs, rather than, the craft of making something artisanally, which is how automobiles used to be made. So public defenders have the impossible task of trying to provide adequate care to their clients when, in every place I know of, the caseloads make it impossible for these very talented and dedicated lawyers to give adequate counsel to the people they are representing. And therefore, many public defenders get a bad rap because from the outside, it looks like they're just counseling everyone to take the plea, take the plea, take the plea, when the system makes adequate defense nearly impossible because there's no time and no resources. They don't have investigators, they don't have time to study the case, they don't have time to go out and do any kind of background work. There's nothing that can be done. So public defenders have often shown up to organization meetings for abolitionist organizations like California Prison Moratorium Project and other organizations to figure out what they can do, not so much in their line of work, but to find the kind of abolitionist presence in their work to help the larger movement. We've also had architects and designers who've done the same thing because the expansion of prisons has meant that many, especially junior architects and entry-level designers, find themselves renovating a prison or a jail rather than building a school or a park or a museum.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. All right. Next question. A lot of the conversation around Breonna Taylor involves her murderers not getting charged with her murder. When we speak from an abolitionist point of view, what does justice look like for Breonna?
Great question. All these questions are so good. They're the best questions. Obviously, I cannot speak on behalf of Breonna Taylor's loved ones, but from the abolitionist perspective, justice for Breonna would mean minimally there would never be another no-knock, ever. That would be justice. When a police officer killed a young man called Oscar Grant at the Fruitvale subway station, metro station in Oakland, California on New Year's Eve, New Year's Day, some years ago, many people said, not surprisingly, that officer should be charged. That officer must face the law. What some people brought to that conversation was this. The officer would not have had any reason to talk to Oscar Grant if mass transit were free. If mass transit were free, which it is many places. People think that there is no such thing as fully subsidized mass transit. So that's one set of issues. What are the large changes that would reduce the likelihood that the kind of encounter that results in premature death, which is part of my definition of racism, how to reduce those kinds of encounters. But also, crime and punishment is not the same thing as coming to an acknowledgement of what kind of harm one has done and coming to an agreement, which can take a very long time to do, with a community about how to make that community whole, right? So should the man who killed Oscar Grant have to be held accountable for what he did? Yes. Should the police who killed Breonna Taylor be held accountable? Yes. Is that the same thing as saying, well, cages are the answer for every harm? No, because what happens is all that we are doing is reproducing the problem that I described earlier in our conversation, which is the problem of imagining that the way to solve a problem is to kill it. And if not to kill it, to put it in a cage. So these are the thoughts that I have to share. And something else I will say for those of you who don't know. Many people like to say, oh, well, Gilmore, if you had suffered. The fact is I did. The fact is I came to believing what I believe and acting on what I act on because of murder, not in spite of murder.
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Gilmore, for sharing that as well. We definitely live in a system, in a society that really relies, right, on prisons and these systems of organized violence, as you have described, to solve all of our societal problems all over, the nation, but also all over the world. With that being said, I will move on to our last question for this afternoon. That comes from Sofia Sarantocas. I hope I'm saying your name correctly. Please forgive me if I'm not. And she asked, can you speak to why it's so crucial for us to be making maximalist demands, particularly in this movement of upheaval?
Thank you for, I'm so sorry it's our last question. I'm just getting warmed up. if I'm understanding the question, you mean go big. Instead of saying tweak Armageddon at the margin, let us say, what do we need? Now, I have been thinking about this a lot. I teach at the City University of New York. New York is a big city, 8 million people plus. It had tens of thousands of people die of COVID, and it will suffer a very long, very deep economic depression because so many businesses have closed, and modestly educated people in the prime of life, who are the most vulnerable to, beyond elderly people like myself, but they are the most vulnerable to COVID because they are out being essential workers, whether they're are delivery people or working in restaurants and so forth, in addition to those who are less modestly educated, but still frontline workers like healthcare workers. What I think should happen is that the city of New York should establish a municipal, full-scale welfare state. New York looks like it's a gleaming playground of the super rich. But what it is a city of working class people still, mostly, who work for people who live in a few districts of that big city, and for firms that are, stretch around the world, like Amazon, whose owner lives in the state of Washington. And the resources to pay for the city of New York to have adequate schools and universal health care would be focused on the transactions that happen at Wall Street, which is the kind of, pulsing heart of the capitalist world. Indeed, as I said earlier today, what we're experiencing in different ways in different parts of the world is capitalism saving capitalism from capitalism. So in the case of the United States, where healthcare comes as a result of having a job rather than a result of being alive, where unemployment comes as a result of having certain kinds of jobs rather than having been a worker, where the mythical figure of the taxpayer seems only to focus on people who have certain kinds of income with income taxes withheld by their employer, rather than people who pay all of the taxes and fees on sales tax and fees and use fees that constitute huge streams of revenue to states. All of these people whose experience of COVID has been worse the closer they live to and work to the super rich are the people who ought to be able to participate in a city with adequate schools, with adequate teachers, with adequate public transportation, which has been neglected for decades, and with adequate other social provisioning so that we can all enjoy the preciousness of life. So that is how I think about it. But I also don't think that municipalism is the answer to anything. It's just the way I was thinking about it when somebody from, I don't know, like the New York Times said, would you write an op-ed? Which I think I probably won't, but that was the theme I was going to put forward to see what would happen. When we look at other countries that have stronger social welfare systems, and especially where healthcare is not attached to whether or not you have a job, and is not sifted through any number of also low-waged workers going down lists, deciding with you on the phone whether or not you can or cannot have a certain kind of treatment. We see, for example, that the success with dealing with the pandemic has been extremely good, even if the country is relatively poor, because the configuration of people, places, and things in the context of capitalism, saving capitalism from capitalism, has not so fully enabled the kind of profound organized abandonment and then concomitant organized violence that brought us together to have this conversation today.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gilmore. It has been an honor and a pleasure to have you this afternoon. And I'm so grateful that we got to have this really critical conversation that needs to continue to happen all over this country. I will now pass it back to the Dean for the closing remarks.
Thank you, Niolis, and thank you, Dr. Gilmore. It is truly an honor for you to join us today as we kick off this series. I'm so incredibly honored that you chose to join us, and thank you so much for all of your thoughts today. I know many of us are going to be rewatching and thinking about this a lot. Thank you, Niolis, for moderating our session. You were an excellent moderator today. I really appreciate all of the work that you put into preparing these questions. And thank you to all of you who were part of this event today. I hope you'll continue to share your thoughts about today's event on your social media channels and continue to engage with us using our hashtag #SocialJusticeUH. I'd also want to thank our incredible staff, Renia Butler, Canice Warren, and everyone in our communications department who helped to make this event a success, and particularly all the work that went into researching how to do a virtual event. I really appreciate all of you. As I mentioned when we began, at the GCSW, we're committed to continuing these conversations. So I hope you'll stay connected to us via our social media channels, our website, our electronic newsletter. And if you're interested in learning more, I hope you'll continue to participate in this series of events. Our next event, featuring Derecka Purnell, is on Friday, October 16th, in which we'll continue to explore abolition with a specific focus on the harm that is caused by our systems of policing, child welfare, and ICE. Then on October 20th and 21st, I hope you'll join us for the first national convening of the upEND movement to learn more about our efforts to end the current child welfare system and the harm it causes. Thank you all for joining us today, and I hope to see you all at our next event. Thank you.